The morning of my wedding, before the sun came up, the man I was about to marry stood me in the middle of my mother's kitchen and told me to turn around slowly. He had not said good morning. He had not touched my hand. He walked one full circle around me with a lamp held up beside my shoulder, close enough that I could feel the heat of the glass on my cheek, and he looked at me the way my father looked at a heifer at the spring auction. Then he stopped. He reached toward my collar and he moved one straight pin, half an inch. Not even that. And he said, "Now she cannot say anything." I was 20 years old. I had been awake since 3:30. And I stood there in the dark with the stove ticking behind me, and I understood something I did not have the words for yet. I was not being admired. I was being cleared. Before I tell you who she was and what he was actually looking for, and the one item on that list I did not understand for 9 more years, until a woman with a diploma on her wall said one sentence that took the floor out from under me, let me tell you who I am. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio, in one of the stricter districts, where the buggies are black and the dresses are darker than the ones tourists photograph in Pennsylvania. I left when I was 26. This is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where women like me finally say the things we were raised to swallow. Hannah gave me this space to tell my story in my own words, and I intend to use all of it. If you want to keep hearing the truth about plain life from the women who actually lived inside it, subscribe and tap the like button. And in the comments, tell me what town or what country you are watching from. I read every single one. Then tell me one more thing. Has anyone in your life ever looked you over before you were allowed to be seen? Now let me explain what happened in that kitchen, because it was not romance, and it was not cruelty. It was procedure. People outside our world imagine an Amish wedding as a quiet thing. It is not. It is the largest event most families will ever hold. Ours are held after the harvest, on a Tuesday or a Thursday, never on a weekend, because the days in between are needed for cooking and hauling benches and scrubbing a house down to the baseboards. 300 people came to mine. Some drove in from Indiana. The service ran close to 4 hours on backless wooden benches, in Pennsylvania Dutch and High German, with singing out of the Ausbund that stretches one line of a hymn across several minutes. And for every one of those hours, every eye in that room has somewhere to rest. There is no music, no decoration, no flowers, no photographs. There is a bride. That is the part nobody thinks through. In a world built on Demit, which means humility, and terrified of Hochmut, which means pride, being looked at is the most dangerous position a woman can occupy. And the bride is the one woman in the district who cannot avoid it. She will be looked at by 300 people for 4 hours. So she cannot simply be dressed. She has to be correct, not beautiful. Correct. That is what the inspection is for. And yes, there is a list. Nobody ever wrote it down. That is the whole nature of the Ordnung, our rules, which govern the width of a hat brim and the color of a buggy and how a woman fastens her clothing, and almost none of which exists on paper anywhere. But every woman in my district could have recited this list in her sleep, and every one of us was checked against it on the morning we married. 1. The prayer covering. The cap. How many pleats it carries, how far forward it sits on the crown, whether the strings hang loose or are tied under the chin. A covering pushed too far back on the head is not carelessness. It is a message. It says, this woman has decided to let her face be seen. 2. The hair. Center part, pulled flat, wound and pinned. Not one strand loose at the temples. I inherited a wave from my mother's side, and I hated it the way other girls hate a scar. From the age of 12, I wet my hair with cold tea and pressed it down with both palms until my arms ached, because a wave is not humble. A wave suggests softness. Softness suggests wanting. 3. The color of the dress. Each district approves its own shades, and the approved ones are handed down without ever being announced. A blue that is one shade too bright is not a preference. It is pride wearing a costume, and everyone in that room will know it by the second hymn. 4. The cape and the apron. Pinned into place, never sewn. A woman who stitches her cape down to save herself trouble in the morning has quietly decided that her own convenience matters more than the way it has always been done. That is the exact definition of the sin we were raised to fear most. 5. The pins themselves. Straight pins, no buttons, because buttons are worldly. Buttons belong to soldiers and to men who want to be admired. The number of pins, the spacing, whether any head is showing. My mother could see a wrong pin from across a room. 6. The shoes and the black stockings, plain, laced, polished, without a mark on them, and this on a farm, in Ohio, in November. 7. The face. Nothing on it, and nothing in it. No shine, nothing added, and no expression that a watching congregation could read as excitement. 6 of those things are cloth. The 7th one is a person. And before somebody writes to me that this is not how it is where their cousin lives, let me say plainly that it is not the same everywhere. It never has been. In the New Order communities there is more conversation, more room, and in some of them a bride and her mother will laugh together on that morning. In the Schwarzentruber districts, the most conservative of all of us, the rules are heavier than anything I am describing to you, and the morning is quieter still. Plain does not mean one thing. It means several hundred slightly different things, and each district decides its own, and nobody outside that district gets a vote. I am telling you about mine. Ohio, Old Order, a district of about 30 families, where the covering had a specific number of pleats, and everybody knew the number and nobody could tell you where it came from. Let me tell you about my friend Naomi, because this is not one bad family and one bad morning. Naomi married 2 years before I did. On her wedding morning, her mother-in-law crossed the kitchen in front of both gathered families, took her by the shoulder, turned her a quarter turn toward the window, and said in Pennsylvania Dutch, loud enough for the room, "Go up and do it again." Naomi went up the stairs. She came back down 11 minutes later. She told me years afterward that she counted every one of those minutes on the clock at the top of the landing, and she has never once forgotten the number. Then she came down, and she smiled, and she served food to 300 people for the rest of that day, and she was married before sundown. Nobody in that room called what happened cruelty. They called it standards. And that is the thing I want you to sit with. It was not a secret. It happened in a full kitchen. It happened in daylight. So now you understand what my husband was doing with that lamp. His name was Amish. He was 23, he could roof a barn, and set a broken fence post in frozen ground. And he had a mother named Fanny, who had a reputation the way some men have a reputation. Fanny had sent word once, during our courtship, that the hem on one of my everyday dresses hung lower than the district kept them. Word came through his sister, to my sister, to me. Nobody said it to my face. That is how correction travels in a plain community, sideways and never signed. Amos came into that kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, knowing his mother would be through the door by 7. He circled me once. He looked at the covering, the part in my hair, the line of the cape, the shoes. He did not smile at me. I understand now that he could not, because he was not looking at me at all. He was looking through his mother's eyes. And you cannot smile out of somebody else's face. And then he reached in and moved that single pin at my collar, 1/2 inch, and said the only words he said to me before our wedding. Now she cannot say anything. Let me be completely honest with you about what that hour felt like, because it is not what people expect. I was not sad, I was not angry, I was efficient, my hands were already working. There were 40 pounds of potatoes waiting, and celery to be creamed, and the benches were still coming off the wagon in the yard, and a bride in my community cooks on her own wedding morning like everybody else. The house smelled of coffee and wood smoke and wet boots. My father was laughing somewhere out by the barn in the dark. Somebody was crying upstairs, and it was not me, it was a cousin's baby. And underneath all of that, in a part of myself I would not be able to reach for another 9 years, I was performing a calculation. I was checking my own collar against a rule I had never been told out loud, for a woman who had not arrived yet, in a kitchen where nobody had said one word about it. Fanny arrived at 7 with 2 pies, and her own daughters behind her. The kitchen filled, and I stood by the stove with my hands folded because I did not know what to do with them, and she came across that floor, and she stopped in front of me, and she looked. She looked at the covering. She looked at the part in my hair. She looked at the hem. And then her eyes came to rest on my collar, on the pin her son had already moved, and they stayed there for what felt like a long time. And then she said, "The potatoes need starting." That was it. That was the entire verdict. I had passed. There is no word in my language for what that felt like. It was not joy, and it was not relief. It was the feeling of a door closing quietly somewhere behind you, in another room, while you are busy with something else. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here, not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now let me tell you the thing about that morning that took me almost a decade to see. And it has nothing to do with Fanny. The white cape and apron I wore that day were not everyday clothing. They were made for the wedding by my mother and my aunts in the weeks before. And on the morning after, I folded them the way I had been taught, and I laid them at the bottom of the cedar chest, and I did not take them out again. Because in my community, a woman is buried in the apron she was married in. That is not a story. That is the practice. The garment is made once, worn once, folded and kept. It waits in the chest through every year of a woman's life, through the children and the winters and the funerals of other people, and then it is taken out one final time, and she is dressed in it, and that is how she is put into the ground. So the cloth that was inspected most carefully on the morning of my wedding, the cape and the apron, the pinning, the exact fall of the white against the dark dress was the cloth I would be buried in. It was checked once at the beginning. It would be used once at the end. And everything I was ever going to be happened in the years between those 2 mornings, in a chest, in the dark, folded. I have thought about that more than almost anything else from that life. Now I want to say something about Amos, because it would be easy to end this by making him the villain, and that would be a lie. 4 years into our marriage, at a family gathering, I watched his father take him aside in the yard before the service. I watched that old man check the length of his son's hair against the line of his ear. I watched him look at the brim of his hat and his suspenders and the shape of his beard, which a married man grows, and a mustache which no man is permitted, because a mustache belonged to soldiers. I watched a grown man of 27 stand still and let his father turn him. Amos had been inspected, too. He had been inspected his entire life. On his own wedding morning, somebody had walked a circle around him with a lamp. I asked him about it that night, and he did not understand why I was upset. He said, "I thought I was helping you." And that is when I understood the real shape of it, because he was helping me. If he had not moved that pin, his mother would have moved it in front of the room, the way Naomi's mother-in-law did, and I would have carried that mourning for the rest of my life the way Naomi carries hers. He stood between me and that. He did it at 4:30 in the morning without being asked. He was helping me. That is the worst part. In a system like that one, the kindest thing available to a man is to inspect his wife before somebody else does. That is not cruelty. That is something harder to look at than cruelty. I left when I was 26. The cost came immediately, the way it always does. Meidung, the shunning, Letters returned with my own handwriting facing back at me. My mother on a borrowed telephone, breathing, not speaking, until the line went quiet. And 9 years after that kitchen, I sat in a small room with a window in it, across from a woman I was paying to listen to me, and I told her the list, all 7. The covering, the hair, the color, the cape, the pins, the shoes, the face. I told it the way I had learned to tell it, quickly, lightly, almost as a joke. She did not laugh. She waited a moment, and then she said, "They were not checking whether you looked right. They were checking whether you had begun to want something." Number 7. The face. Nothing on it, and nothing in it. No expression a watching congregation could read as excitement. They were not inspecting my clothing. My clothing was only the part you could measure. They were inspecting me for evidence of a self, and the cloth was simply where a self would show first. I did not cry in that room. I sat very still with my hands folded, exactly the way I had stood by that stove at 20 years old, and I felt something move underneath everything, slow and cold and enormous. It was not sadness. It took me another year of Tuesday afternoons to find the right word for it, and the word was grief. And it was not for me. It was for every woman who had stood in a kitchen at 4:30 in the morning and passed. I want to be honest about what that world also gave me, because I owe it that. It gave me a work ethic that has carried me through every hard year since. It gave me a community with a texture I have never found anywhere else. People who arrive at your door within an hour of bad news and stay until the work is finished, without being asked, without being thanked. It gave me a faith that is complicated now and wounded now, but is still, after everything, mine. But there is no scripture that requires a woman to be checked over like a fence line before she is permitted to be looked at. There is no commandment about the number of pleats in a covering. Those rules were never written down, and that was not an accident. A rule you can read is a rule you can question. The ones that shape you are the ones nobody ever says out loud. The last year before I left, my younger sister Lydia was published in church. 19 years old, engaged, her wedding set for the fall. She came into the kitchen the week before it, in the dress that had been made for her, and she stood in the doorway with her hands twisting in her apron, and she said, "Is it right?" And I heard my own voice say, "Turn around slowly." I want you to understand exactly what happened in me at that moment, because it is the reason I am sitting here. I heard those 3 words come out of my own mouth in my own kitchen, and I heard whose words they were, and I heard how easily they had been waiting in me the whole time. 12 years. I had been on the receiving end of that sentence, and I had it ready, fully formed, no effort at all, and Lydia was already turning. She had already started, because that is what you do. I took her by the shoulders, and I turned her back around to face me, and I said, "Stop." And she looked at me, frightened, because I had gone off the script and neither of us had another one. I said, "I do not care about the pin." And I asked her a question nobody had ever asked me on any morning of my life. I asked her if she was frightened. She started crying. In a plain kitchen, in the middle of the afternoon, over nothing, over a question. She cried for a long time, and I held on to her, and neither of us said what it was about because we did not have to. She was married that fall. Her covering was correct. Everything was correct. If you were raised in a house where being good and being obedient were the same word, I see you. If you have ever stood in a doorway and asked somebody, "Is it right?" meaning "Am I acceptable?" meaning "Will I be permitted?" I see you. And if you have ever heard your mother's voice come out of your own mouth and felt your stomach drop, then you already know that these things do not end when you leave. They end the first time you catch one in the air and refuse to hand it on. I was checked 7 ways on the morning of my wedding. Not one of them was whether I was happy. Nobody thought to look for that. There was no line on the list for it. And a thing with no line on the list, in a world like that one, is a thing that does not exist. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life, your